At this very moment, somewhere in the northern part of Tanzania, a Hadza man is resting quietly in the shade. He has finished his work for the day. The Hadza are one of the last remaining hunter-gatherer groups on Earth, and they still live in the same manner that all humans did for 300,000 years. Our ancient ancestors worked only about 2.5 hours each day. This time was spent on hunting, gathering, cooking, and every other chore required to keep them alive. Most of us complete that amount of labor before our lunch break. They have never been told to be at a specific place at a designated time. They also suffer from almost none of the chronic diseases that commonly kill people in modern society. They share more laughter with their families in a single afternoon than most of us do with ours over the course of an entire week. Every researcher who has lived among them returns with the same observation, noting that they appear to be much happier than we are. So, what do they actually do with their time all day? In 1968, an anthropologist named Richard Lee published years of data on the Kung Bushmen of the Kalahari Desert. He tracked their daily activities down to the minute. His calculations showed they worked only about 15 hours per week. Your ancestors did not have an employer to answer to. They did not have to pay rent for their shelter. They had no need for weekends, because every day of their lives was already mostly a weekend. Let us walk through a typical day in their camp. At sunrise, you wake up as the sky begins to brighten, the temperature shifts, and the camp starts to move around you. You sleep on an animal hide laid over flattened grass, perhaps near a small fire that someone kept burning during the night. Everything you own fits easily into a single bag. This includes a digging stick, a hunting bow, a few hides, and perhaps some beads given to you by a daughter or a sister. There are roughly 25 to 30 people living in your camp. You know every single one of them personally, and you have known them for your entire life. Your grandmother sleeps only a few feet away from your children. Nobody is governed by a clock. The first hour of the day is spent talking. A study by anthropologist Polly Wiesner found that the Bushmen spend hours every day engaged in casual conversation. This is not gossip in a trivial sense. Instead, this daily conversation serves as the operating system that keeps the camp running. They discuss who is sleeping with whom, who took more than their fair share of food yesterday, who told a good joke last week, and who has been unusually quiet and might be falling sick. This communication also functions as their entire legal system. The way the Kung maintained order in their community was simply by talking about one another. If a man hoarded meat, the camp members made jokes about him until he stopped doing it. If a woman broke a promise, the whispered reports traveled to every camp within a day's walk. If your behavior became completely unbearable, eventually no camp would allow you to stay. That is the harshest punishment a hunter-gatherer can face, though it almost never had to be used. In 1969, the anthropologist Richard Lee witnessed this social dynamic happen to himself. He had been living alongside the Kung for several years. When Christmas arrived, he wanted to do something nice for the community. So he purchased the largest, fattest ox he could find and brought it back to the camp. The Kung proceeded to make fun of his gift for several weeks. They told Lee that the ox was too skinny, the meat would taste terrible, and he had wasted the time of the entire group. Lee was confused by their reaction because he had checked the ox carefully and knew it was a great animal. So he finally asked an old man to explain what was going on. The old man explained that when a Kung hunter brings home a big kill, the camp does not celebrate. Instead, they mock the catch, saying the animal is small and the meat is bad. The bigger the kill, the harder they mock the hunter. That is the method the Kung used to keep their hunters from thinking they are better than everyone else. They had been doing the same thing to Lee. He had brought a great gift, so they had to reduce his self-importance. In a Kung camp, no one is permitted to feel superior to anyone else. Every joke, every complaint, and every whispered story is a tiny tool used to keep people equal. We built prisons to enforce order, but they handled their problems by talking to each other. By mid-morning, the men start to gather for the hunt. Hunting is highly dramatic, but it is also very unreliable. Frank Marlowe, who studied the Hadza for decades, discovered that on any given day, most hunters return to camp empty-handed. A successful kill happens only once every few days, and sometimes even less often. A Hadza hunter might walk 20 miles in a single day, track a wounded animal for hours, lose the trail, and come home with nothing but a few small birds and a sore back. However, when they do make a connection, they connect hard. Their arrows are tipped with a lethal poison made from the sap of the desert rose. The hunter shoots the prey, then tracks the animal for hours while the poison takes effect. They have brought down everything from antelope to giraffe using this method. And yet, the hunters are not the ones who actually feed the camp. The women are. Among the Hadza, women provide more than half of the camp's daily calories. They go out in groups of 3 to 8 every day. They climb, dig, and gather, returning with a steady supply of food that does not depend on luck. That walk back to camp is where most of the camp's gossip and decisions actually take place. The men occasionally provide a feast, but the women are the ones who consistently sustain the population. The most productive gatherers in the camp are usually the grandmothers. Women in their 50s and 60s routinely collect more daily food than mothers in their 20s. Many of them are still walking 5 to 10 miles a day well into their 70s. Anthropologists refer to this as the grandmother hypothesis. It explains why humans are the only primate species whose women live for decades past menopause. The core idea is that grandmothers feeding their grandchildren made the entire species more successful in terms of survival. The children accompany them on these trips. A Hadza 3-year-old plays with a small digging stick next to her mother, who is busy digging up the day's food. By the age of 6, she can find food on her own. By 10, she is contributing meaningfully to the family. By 8, a Hadza boy can be sent out alone with his bow and return with a bird. That is simply what an 8-year-old does. Anthropologist David Lancy studied dozens of traditional communities and found that children spent most of their day playing in mixed-age groups. The older kids taught the younger ones, and adults rarely interfered. A child who fell down was usually picked up by another child, and a child who asked a question was usually answered by a sibling. This is how human children learned for hundreds of thousands of years. Through watching, copying, and playing at the work the adults were doing right next to them. This is the school humans evolved to attend. Midday arrives, and the first food returns to camp. It gets shared immediately. Sharing is not optional. It is a strict rule. If a Hadza man kills a large animal, he does not own that meat. Instead, he distributes it. The hunter himself often gets one of the worst cuts of meat, while the rest of the camp receives the remainder. Anthropologists believe this constant sharing is one of the key factors that built the human brain. Tracking who gave what to whom, who skipped a turn, and who stepped up when it mattered requires a level of social arithmetic no other species has ever needed. In this society, generosity serves as the primary savings account. In the afternoon, after eating, the camp slows down. The middle of the day is hot, and nobody works through the intense heat. People nap, sit in the shade, repair their arrows, weave grass into baskets, or pick lice from each other's hair. While this grooming sounds unpleasant, it takes about an hour and is mostly an excuse to be physically close to the people you love. The middle of the day is for tending to the body. If you have to relieve yourself, you walk a short distance into the bush. There is no toilet paper, so you use leaves, sand, or water, and you do not think much about it. If you are a woman and you are bleeding, you use soft grass or moss. Some cultural groups isolate menstruating women, but the Hadza do not. You simply go about your day. If you want to have sex, you have sex. Hunter-gatherer cultures do not pile shame on top of intimacy. There is privacy when people want it, but not the heavy taboo we attach to it in modern times. And yes, conflicts do happen sometimes. These people are human, not saints. They experience affairs, jealousy, stolen tools, and grudges that flare up. But the way conflicts ended was different. In a culture where you can pack everything you own in 15 minutes and walk to the next camp, most disputes ended by one party simply leaving. The Bushmen called this voting with their feet. If you could not stand someone, you went somewhere else for a few weeks. By the time you came back, the anger had passed. Most of us cannot do that when we have a mortgage and a job. In the late afternoon, the pace picks up again. People visit other camps, walking a few miles to see relatives, trade gossip, and perhaps arrange a marriage. The same handful of camps stay connected this way, year after year, generation after generation. By adulthood, you know more than 100 people personally, every one of them by name and full history. The hunters return. Some days they have a kill, but most days they do not. The women who gathered all day quietly become the day's heroes whenever the hunters come back empty-handed, which is most of the time. Evening arrives, and cooking begins. They roast roots in the coals, boil meat in pouches using hot stones, split fruit, and chew seeds soft for the children. Then comes the meal, shared by the whole camp. Everyone participates. They have done this together every night for 300,000 years. This is not a perfect paradise. They get sick, bury their children, lose people they love, and they fight and grieve like anyone else. But there is a kind of suffering they do not seem to know. They do not experience the slow modern ache of working at a job we do not believe in to pay for a life that never quite arrives. They do not lie awake at night, comparing themselves to strangers they suspect are happier than they are. In the late 1960s, an anthropologist looking at all this evidence called early humans the original affluent society. He did not mean they possessed material wealth, as they had almost nothing. He meant they had time. We made trades, and they were real ones. We got vaccines, antibiotics, refrigeration, and indoor plumbing. We got much longer lives. We got fewer children dying before they turned 5, which in a hunter-gatherer camp used to happen to roughly 4 out of every 10 children. We got real wins, and nobody is suggesting we go back. But we also made trades we do not talk about. We invented agriculture. We invented work that someone else owns. We invented bosses, and we invented bills. You inherited their bodies. You have the same nervous systems, and the same need for sun, sleep, touch, conversation, and time spent doing genuinely nothing. We are still hunter-gatherers. We just stopped doing it.